2016, I was at the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in Washington, D.C., along with the American Indian Movement, as it was then known. And when I was 17 in 1973, for a while I was inside of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, when there was a standoff between the American Indian Movement, the Oglala Sioux, and U.S. Marshals and the FBI. I was a high school dropout at the time. That situation there convinced me to go back to university. I attended several Native Studies programs and started to become a policy advisor to First Nations bands and organizations, and that's what I've continued to do, is advocate, not as a lawyer, but as a policy person. From 1867, the Indian Act was adopted, and the Indian Act had two conflicting objectives. One was to protect the rights of Indians and Indian lands. The other was to assimilate Indians into the Canadian body politic. In 1969, the government proposed to terminate the Aboriginal treaty rights of First Nations. The First Nations fought back, and as the Constitution was patriated, they included Section 35 in there to recognize and affirm existing Aboriginal treaty rights. The Ministers' Conferences on Aboriginal Matters in the 1980s, there were 4 of them. Those ended in failure without an agreement to define Aboriginal treaty rights. Following that, the government's position was there were no rights unless they were negotiated. And they instituted land claims and self-government policies that First Nations went into, and they basically compromised their Section 35 rights in the final agreements. Conservative government has policy objectives in their comprehensive claims and land and self-government policies to turn First Nation communities into municipalities by converting their Aboriginal title into fee simple lands. The federal government is assessing 93 negotiating tables across the country that are negotiating comprehensive claims agreements and self-government agreements. They're going to assess which ones are prepared to terminate their rights under these policies, and the other ones will have their funding cut. What the government has done is used the agreements, the final agreements they've reached with First Nations across the country as precedents to use against other First Nations who are negotiating. Those groups that have entered into final agreements, they created a whole new organization called the Land Clearance Agreement Coalition to lobby the federal government to implement their modern treaties. And to this day, the modern treaties are still lobbying to get the government to implement them. First Nations should suspend all the negotiations right now and demand that the government change their policy from being one of denial and extinguishment to recognition and affirmation as set out in the Constitution. The chiefs have been unable to get the government to respect them. So it's really up to the people now. And this is where the I Don't Know More movement and the Defenders of the Land Network have come together to encourage the people to start taking action, sustained actions across the country this spring and this summer, within the goal of getting the federal government to reverse its policies of denial and extinguishment to recognizing and affirming Aboriginal treaty rights. So that's where the hope is in the people. That's how I keep positive, is looking where I can across the country to see the people standing up and doing something about it and not being idle anymore.